I think what you have to do from an event perspective or from a business perspective is understand that this year is going to have a fair amount of uncertainty, a fair amount of fits and starts, while also reinvesting in your business and trying to gain competitive advantages at the expense of your, let's say your business adversaries. With the degree of uncertainty that we have this year, I think it's imperative to try to develop a narrative that allows people to move forward in a reasonably confident manner, but not either get too stingy or overinvest in an environment that we, at this point, is still, I think, uncertain enough that it could create some problems for your business down the road.
Welcome to today's version of the Keynote Curators Podcast. I'm Seth Dechtman. I'm your host, the founder and president of the Keynote Curators. Our guest today is Ron Insana. Ron is a CNBC senior analyst and commentator, a trailblazing financial journalist, best-selling author, and financial professional. In our conversation, we cover the current and long-term economic panorama, and more importantly, what opportunities are there given the current situation for your business and your organization. Ron shares with us his insights of having interviewed world leaders, presidents, celebrities, media moguls, and how we can glean the best practices that they use to create their own success. Ron is a wealth of information. He's an extraordinary keynote speaker and a lot of fun to work with. Thanks for joining us. Listen in, you'll be smarter for it. Hello and welcome to today's version of the Keynote Curators Podcast. I'm Seth Dechtman, your host and the president of the Keynote Curators. But more importantly, our guest, Ron Insana, has joined us today to share all things about the economy and all things that meeting planners in particular might want to know what to look out for in the world of business and any trends that would be important and relevant to them. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate you having me, Seth.
You're very welcome. Ron, before we get into my litany of interview questions, why don't you just share with us a little bit about what you think our audience, it would be important for them to know about you. And as I said, the majority of them are meeting professionals, meeting planners, event planners.
Well, I've spent, the better part of almost 40 years now, 39 years, either a financial journalist, at one time, hedge fund of funds manager. I've been an advisor to Schroders, which is an international money management firm, and have done everything in between, continuing on with my contributorship at CNBC as well. So I've had, in some ways, a slightly different vantage point than a lot of financial journalists insofar as after 23 years as a full-timer, I went off and attempted, sadly, during the great financial crisis or just before, to run money. But throughout that period and throughout my time as a speaker and then also consulting with large financial firms, I've got a lot of boots on the ground experience. I've got some inside experience that I think has become invaluable to me, understanding how financial firms operate, what their goals and objectives are, how their thought processes work with respect to forecasting the future with regard to markets, economics, both domestic and global, and how all of these things kind of are intertwined and how, when you also step back, politics and geopolitics affect that framework as well. Having spent a lot of time interviewing politicians and world leaders when I was a full-time journalist, I've had the benefit really of doing a lot of things over the course of the last 39 years that have allowed me to develop, I think, a fairly concise but also comprehensive view of what's going on in the economic and business world, writ large.
Yeah. I mean, do you ever just pinch yourself and say, oh my gosh, what, like, I know you've interviewed presidents and world leaders and financial industry titans, and what a thrill.
Oh yeah. Listen, I mean, it's having been a film major in college, and actually I'm on the side doing a little of that work these days as well. But having been a film major in college and having thought I was going to go in a different direction, and then suddenly, just by happenstance, through a friend in high school, getting a job at Financial News Network, which was the forerunner to CNBC,
right,
and then spending 39 years doing what I've been doing, and as you say, interviewing presidents Clinton and Bush, talking to George Soros, Julian Robertson, Warren Buffett, business leaders Jack Welch, Bill Gates. All those folks, Hillary Clinton, Ann Mulcahy, all these different folks that have come through over the course of my time, it really does give you a unique window on the thought process with respect not just to leadership, but also to success, to how truly powerful, successful, or wealthy individuals think what kind of matrix they use, how they play three-dimensional chess every day, what are the key characteristics of folks like them, and one of those characteristics is insatiable curiosity.
Right.
One of the things I've found, sitting across from a lot of these people is once the camera stopped rolling, they would ask me as many questions as I just asked them.
Yeah.
They're always looking for that extra nugget. They're always looking for that fill in the blank. And I thought that over the course of my career has been a fascinating thing to not just come to understand, but then hopefully emulate as well in my own work.
Yeah, it's that kind of innate, it's almost in their DNA, that sense of wonder. And it's natural whether the camera is on or off.
Oh yeah, when I worked for Jack Welch for years, and if Jack felt like it, he'd pick up the phone and call up and say, what are you seeing?
Yeah.
I'm not hearing from somebody in this corner of my business. What do you think?
Yeah.
And that was with Bob Wright, who was also one of my bosses, and it was also true of Buffett and a whole host of others. Stan Druckenmiller, famous hedge fund manager. They always ask the question, and also think all the time, what am I missing? What is it that I might get from somebody else? Even if we may have different levels of access to different types of information, I might have something that's a boots on the ground type piece of information that they don't get necessarily at their level. And they just want to know. And that's, I found that fascinating that, the two-way component of that, Bob Rubin, Carlos Gutierrez, folks like that in government, we'd have exchanges all the time to kind of just talk it out amongst ourselves to figure out what the hell was going on in the world,
Right. And given some of their positions being a little bit distant from boots on the ground, if it's a simple question like, what do you see or what are you working on, which is one that I learned from some of the titans that I've been fortunate enough to be around or be near and interact with, a simple question like, what are you working on that turns you on or that has your interest right now? And that's kind of open-ended to infinity,
Yeah. And the flip side is, you could see some, very, very smart people, very influential people get ground down in certain positions and refuse to change their mind irrespective of incoming data. And that, kind of recency bias or confirmation bias that exists among all of us. But I mean, sometimes you'll see it in policymakers and, you're scratching your head saying, okay, I'm seeing something different. I'm not formally trained. I'm not a Harvard economist. I'm not up for a Nobel Peace Prize for my economic work. But by the same token, some of those folks who will get ground down in a position and they'll just stay there. And you say, hey, but what about this? And they may answer, they may not. But I mean, you're throwing it out there for other people to debate. And I think that's, equally as important to kind of challenge. This is not conventional wisdom, but challenge any wisdom that's out there that might be very linear in its construction. And I think, having a nonlinear framework in our world helps quite a bit in understanding which way things can go economically, market-wise, even politically and geopolitically over time.
Taking that into account, just building on that and this breadth of experience where it's kind of, you pinch yourself, whether it's, a Hollywood person or a world leader or somebody who's emerging, who you said, I interviewed them when, and it was kind of before they're known. Building on that, you could even say, Ron, you have a decorated career and a breadth of experience. What are some of the main themes that you weave into your keynotes? You've spoken to my clients. They've been incredibly taking care of you. You've taken care of them incredibly by what you've delivered and provided, whether it's a panorama of the business horizon or some trends or what to look out for, or how to kind of make sense of some current situations in a bigger context, maybe, and relate it to their specific industry. How do you weave that into your keynotes?
Yeah, I think, what's demanded, I think, of us who engage in this endeavor is a couple of things. Intellectual consistency and honesty, recognizing also when we're wrong, and then some thematic consistency that's based on, 39 years of experience, where you can recognize patterns over time. And as we found in the last couple of years, when you look at something like crypto that's supposed to be an emerging disruptive force, and can you say with some degree of certainty that no, that doesn't work against the framework that I've operated under for 39 years, and here's why. And then you ask, okay, what am I missing about this? Am I missing anything at all? It's the same with artificial intelligence. It's the same with machine learning and all these new technologies that have come on stream. And it was the same when we were going through the internet bubble almost 30 years ago now, where you looked at things and you said, okay, this is transformational technology, but this piece of it means absolutely nothing. So how do you separate what's important from what's transitory? How do you understand trends? How do you understand trends against the backdrop of history? And how do you project forward in some kind of coherent and consistent manner. And again, recognizing your own frailties that you could be wrong, admitting when you are, and moving on and refining your thesis as you go. I think that's critical to the way I've come to approach this. And I've been influenced by a lot of people in that regard, some known, some not. And I think it's just kind of helped me in the craft of delivering the types of commentary that I do, try to maintain a relatively consistent point of view without necessarily being so linear that I get trapped in just a single stream of thought.
Right. It's kind of like just having a common sense coherence to it. It's like you use the word craft. I call it the art, because you have this body of some areas you have more specificity and more command over it. And then some areas you have a notion of it. And then your audiences vary. Some are C-levels, some are high earners, but they might not know some of the deep topics that you've been brought in to talk about. So that craft and that art of synthesizing it down to the heart of the matter, and then delivering in a way that obviously is appealing and engaging and providing something that's going to make a difference for them.
And it's interesting you say it that way, because from a speaking perspective, there are three people that I really learned from who helped me structure the way I think about talking to an audience. First, many, many years ago, I saw Michael Bloomberg give a speech on the future of technology and media technology more specifically, and he spoke extemporaneously for an hour straight. Blew my mind, not a single note in front of him. And then late friend of mine, Joe Battipaglia, who was a market strategist, used to open his speeches with a joke. And at first I kind of didn't get it, given that we were in a serious world and we talked about money, we talked about economics, but it immediately put the audience at ease, and he found ways to entertain along the way. And then I saw my former colleague, Tom Brokaw, do some speeches as well. And his depth of knowledge, the way he constructed a story, was also impressive. So I tried to blend their styles together and come up with my own, so that, I do speak extemporaneously. I like to include stories, and where possible, to include humor, so that you can keep the audience engaged. And the humor should be relevant to what it is I'm discussing. So you just don't go off and, do knock jokes. You're really trying to come up with anecdotes and stories that are both entertaining and instructive. And I think that's, it's one of the challenges in the business of communicating with an audience. And then getting their feedback, to me, is the single most important component of it, which is the Q&A period. I love, because I learn a ton. And again, when you talk about boots on the ground, when you're going city to city around the country, sometimes outside the country, and you're hearing what people's real and legitimate concerns are, whether it's about the existing environment, whether it's about the role of the media and how we influence or shape the narrative, all of those things are really helpful to me, and then just constantly help me refine what it is that I do, so that the audience remains engaged. And the best part about what I do is our world, when it comes to economics, finance, and business, markets, is three-dimensional chess every day. So it changes all the time, and we have to keep plugging in new variables. We have to keep rethinking our points of view and take in new data as it comes, and then try to be as current as is humanly possible when we're in front of an audience. And I think that's critical, is really staying on top of every bit of information that we're capable of absorbing.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if the word is ancillary, but I think one of the unexpected benefits for the speaker is that whether you're speaking to tile contractors, mining and drilling organizations, manufacturers, emergency room nurses, you then, especially in the Q&A and when you do your pre-event preparation, you're getting all this time to delve into industries that perhaps you wouldn't on purpose.
Yep.
So you're constantly expanding your horizon as well, which is, one of these unexpected benefits of doing this.
And then there's the stuff that, I explore just for my own personal edification, whether it's the history of religion, whether it's archaeology, whether it's sports, music, literature, film. All of those things actually continue to help me paint the picture, right?
Yep.
So, you need those pop culture references, particularly if you have an audience that's not C-suite level, but that's maybe more retail, if you will, for lack of a better description.
Sure.
You want those pop culture references. You want to be able to make this as accessible to people as possible. It's funny, and this is, I'm going to use a mild profanity here, but the very first time that I went on the Today Show in 1997, one of my colleagues didn't really want to discuss the bond market in front of the Today Show audience. She didn't feel that she was sufficiently skilled. So she told the Today Show to call me up. And it was the first time I ever went on the Today Show on NBC. And Jeff Zucker, who was the executive producer at the time, walked up to me about 30 seconds before I went on the air, understanding that CNBC was a very much a niche service. He looked at me and said, whatever you do, don't do that shit you do on cable. And so it was like, and I was like, I got it. Speak English. And, from that point on, and we had the Asian currency crisis shortly thereafter, I understood that there are different kinds of audiences.
Right.
And my CNBC audience was radically different than the Today Show audience, which is getting ready for work, making breakfast, putting clothes on. So they're listening, they're not necessarily watching. So you have to come up with an entirely different set of phrases, catchphrases, and you have to frame it in such a way that people can hear it if they can't see you. CNBC is a different animal because we've got graphics on the screen. We're talking over those. We can occasionally use jargon and not necessarily alienate a huge part of the audience. So you have to find that blend that works for any audience combination that you might be in front of.
Right. I mean, the CNBC audience for you is a little bit more the wheelhouse, and there's a predisposition of stuff that they've kind of already understood or would understand, as opposed to you have to know your audience. The classic phrase is reading the room, right?
Yeah. And look, I mean, so I've worked with, at that time that I was going through that stage of my career, I was doing the Today Show, Nightly News, Dateline, Imus in the Morning, where you were required to speak English in each and every case. And I remember doing a piece for Nightly News, and one of the supervising producers who was working on a segment with me, we used to spend about 3 hours banging out a 1 minute, 15-second Q&A during my day. I'd have to get back and forth on the phone. And Ben Sherwood, who ultimately ran ABC News, was my producer at the time. And he's like, is there a different word for this in English, whatever the topic was? It's the only word we happen to have for this particular thing.
Right.
But, I'll put an explainer around it, but I don't have another word for it.
Right.
So you were always kind of, it's like pounding chicken, right? I mean, you're just sitting there and trying to make it as tender as is humanly possible, so that everybody can enjoy it. And it was great training for me. I mean, in the sense that network television requires a different level of translation. And it just makes it that much easier to go in front of people and say, here's the analog for what I'm trying to say. It's like, not to be biblical, but, one famous person spoke in parables. We try to create stories and anecdotes or use, I should say, not create, those stories and anecdotes that really paint the picture of what you would otherwise maybe say in a different way in front of a professional audience.
I don't know if it's completely corresponding analogy, but that works speaking to your children too. You have to do it in a way.
Yeah, we lifted a little higher than that.
Right, but the same skill set, right? If you're speaking to them, you've got to adapt and read the room and use the language that works, right?
I mean, you don't want, when you're talking about the Federal Reserve, you don't want to get involved in like the mechanics and the plumbing of how the Federal Reserve system works when the Fed's raising interest rates and how much slippage there is and exactly what the mechanics are when they do this or that. You want to just distill the essence of what they're doing so that it's relevant to the audience, and then obviously illustrates how it affects and impacts their businesses, maybe their personal lives if appropriate, and ultimately their economic outlook, so that they have some time frame, some window in which they can make decisions on a better informed basis. And I think that's really the way I go about it. And my window's a little narrower than it's been for a while because we have so many variables in front of us. But you try to sketch out the next 3, 6, 9 months, sometimes a year if things are clearer, and lay a foundation so that people have a set of landmarks, if you will, that they can keep an eye on as things progress.
I'd like to use that to segue into a little bit of the current moment. While we are recording this podcast, it is the middle of February. The New Year
Valentine's Day,
Valentine's Day. The New Year is about 6 weeks behind us. And, there's a lot of challenges, which is a euphemism for there are obstacles or barriers that are in the way of the business world. Take into account, again, that, the overwhelming majority of our audience are meeting planners, meeting professionals, event planners. And while I am somebody who barely got through Econ 101, what I do understand is on the global scale, America, the United States is in a great position. Unemployment, manufacturing is coming back, the supply chain is being fortified. There's a lot of opportunity there. I've heard about the bounce back, revenge travel after the pandemic and stuff like that.
Still going on, by the way.
What's that?
it's still going on here.
It's still going on.
I get on a lot of airplanes.
If you could create a little bit of a panorama, or a little bit of a broader context for what the state is of and the conditions in the economy, and then tie it into like what meeting planners who are listening today, what challenges and opportunities, whether it's convention space, travel industry, rooms, food and beverage, ground transportation, all those things, and how they might adapt or take this information and map it onto what their activities are.
Yeah, I think it's almost a binary environment right now where a couple of things can happen. First and foremost, the thing that the Federal Reserve and other economists fear is that inflation, after having slowed down over the last 6 months, and we saw data today that showed it uptick a little bit, that inflation is going to reaccelerate in the second half of the year, force the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates, which in and of itself becomes problematic from where we are today, and then drive us into a recession later in the year. And there are, very, very strong arguments on both sides that one, we're going to have a soft landing and the Fed will have achieved its objective, or two, they are simply going to go too far, in my mind, misperceiving the environment in which we find ourselves. They're terrified that this is the 70s all over again. And so I've looked for other analogs, usually post-war analogs, where you had a burst of inflation after a major disruption, and then inflation starts to come down. That's my expectation. How that affects everybody, I think, is critical, because if I'm wrong, the Fed's going to keep interest rates going higher, and they're going to keep them there for longer. That means the cost of money goes up. It means business is harder to do, and it raises the risk somewhere in the second half of this year of the U.S. economy sinking into a recession at a time when, as you suggested, and however you want to characterize it, the U.S. is the best house in a bad neighborhood, the cleanest shirt in a pile of dirty laundry,
Right.
Whatever you want to say about it. We're actually in reasonably good shape, inflation aside. The economy is growing around 2%. The unemployment rate's at 3.4%. Our biggest problem is that we're short humans in the United States. We have more open jobs than we have unemployed Americans. That's a demographic issue, not a interest rate policy issue. And it's something that I fight with various people about quite frequently. And we have then the profound impact in a post-pandemic environment of changing expectations among workers and consumers. So you have all this happening simultaneously. And that's why I say my forecasting window has narrowed significantly, because it's hard to put this all into the hopper, take the war in Ukraine, the risk that China does something in Taiwan, and we're coming up on an election year, and say, okay, this is the way 2023 plays out. It's hard to be definitive. I think what you have to do from an event perspective or from a business perspective is understand that this year is going to have a fair amount of uncertainty, a fair amount of fits and starts, while also reinvesting in your business and trying to gain competitive advantages at the expense of your, let's say your business adversaries, because there are opportunities here. The U.S. economy is still dynamic. We're still seeing a lot of technological innovation. We're seeing a lot of change. All of that's coming at us with great speed, even as we fight through these other economic, political, and geopolitical issues. So I think that, with the degree of uncertainty that we have this year, I think it's imperative to try to develop a narrative that allows people to move forward in a reasonably confident manner, but not either get too stingy or overinvest in an environment that we, at this point, is still, I think, uncertain enough that it could create some problems for your business down the road.
I'm listening to you intently, honestly, and what comes up is agility, adaptability, and just saying it sounds so cliche, but it really is so true. And then you say it's a demographic problem. And I can tell you, I have the good fortune, and I know, Ron, we've shared some stories where we have the good fortune to be able to travel with our kids, with our family, and do some really cool things. And, this is a first world problem or a first world observation. But, I go to some of these amazing places and they're short on staff, whether it's in the restaurant or in the hotel or an excursion, that typically are filled in by all sorts of demographics, whether it's regionally inside the United States, whether it's a summer job or a temporary job on one seasonal work, or from other countries where there's a mechanism to bring workers in. And, I see that as, I hate the phrase war for talent. Well, I dislike very strongly, as my mother says, war for talent.
You don't hate anybody.
I think the opportunity and the challenge is, and in my very small business, Ron, I've got freelancers, and there's an abundance of them. And that challenge in this environment where there are opportunities with some uncertainty, but you still have to be agile and adaptable along the way. And the opportunity is in your workforce. Do you see something like that where there's an opportunity there?
Absolutely. I mean, but challenges. Okay. So if I could just go backwards in time for a little bit and let's go to the pandemic and what transpired as a consequence. So tragically, 1 million people died, 1.1 million people died or thereabouts. 500,000 of those were working age, right? So we lost 500,000 workers. We subsequently had 3 million people retire early simply because they could. And the pandemic had a profound impact on how people viewed their work-life balance. So you had baby boomers who had accumulated enough savings, enough wealth that they could walk away and say, you know what? I might get COVID. I might be on a ventilator. Something bad might happen to me or my family. I'm out. I got the money. I'm good. 2 million women left the workforce to oversee distance learning. Not all of them have come back, right? Then we've had constraints on immigration. So you have 11 million open jobs and roughly 6 million people or so who are unemployed. We have 1.9 million open jobs for every unemployed American currently. And so that's the framework in which we're operating today. So the war for talent is a war for talent. And then you look at this and say, okay, how do we fix it? Well, we had slowest population growth in the history of the United States in 2021. That's something we're not accustomed to. We've had a bit of a baby bust. Millennials twice tried to get out of the house. Great financial crisis, the pandemic. Twice they moved back in. And so family formation has slowed. So what do? Either, and this is going to sound politically charged to some people, but you either open the borders more generously, however you characterize immigration, legal, what have you, but you need low-skilled, medium-skilled, and high-skilled workers. 85,000 H-1B visas, 450,000 applicants, and even tech companies who are laying people off are still screaming for high-skilled talent.
Right.
Then you've got the other issue, which is in the absence of putting a human being to work, yet last year was the biggest year in the sale of robotics. So now you start looking at a variety of different industries where the war for talent has become the war for technology. So I use quick service restaurants as kind of a benchmark because they're deploying technology very quickly. The experimental McDonald's in Texas that now has just individuals making the food in the back, and you come in and there's a touch screen, and whether you're in the store or going through the drive-through, your food's delivered by conveyor belt. And you're seeing this across the quick service restaurant industry, right? Where robotics, AI, so that you can talk to something that's not a human and still put in an order and get it back correctly. All of that's being deployed very rapidly, and that's happening across industries. And so our solution, in the absence of letting more people in, is effectively mechanizing, once again, our workforce. That in itself is disinflationary, even deflationary. It's going to happen over time. So your war for talent is also your war for technology. So it really depends on what your business is like. Listen, when you think about ChatGPT, when you think of OpenAI, the parent of that company, you think about what Google is doing. We have to worry about whether or not we're going to be replaced. Is somebody going to be able to give my speech, download an extraordinary amount of data, synthesize it, and then put out something that's reasonably cogent enough for an audience to take away something from it? And, you start to worry about that stuff, right? I mean, we're back in Max Headroom days where can you have a virtual anchor deliver the news and have an AI program write it for you without any human intervention?
I had the AI open write my biography, and they had me passing away 11 years ago. So
there's still some bugs to be worked out.
I had to check. I got up, looked in the mirror. I just a few, called my wife and made sure I was still there.
Am I still here? Yeah. And look, this is an educational challenge as well, right? I mean, colleges are losing their minds behind the fact that kids might be able to just hit a button and crank out an essay. So right now I have one child in college at the moment, and plagiarism is the big concern at the moment. So they have all this, aggressive software that can tell immediately whether a kid plagiarized something. They're going to need something else for this.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I think the pendulum is going to be swinging, even social media use. There is a infinitesimal trend of some teenagers that are, I wouldn't say detoxing, but are negating Instagram and, read they're outliers. But I think the pendulum will swing. And with AI too, okay, you're going to plagiarize, but when the rubber hits the road, maybe you go work for a corporation or a small business or a startup. You're not going to have to maybe write an essay, but you're still going to have the ability to comprehend, the ability to analyze and to write, or at least communicate and verbalize. And it's not going to be all all automated,
No, I
behind
mean,
them.
and if you want to sell, you better be good at golf or something else, some other social skill that allows you to interact with other human beings and close the deal, because I'm not sure robots are quite there yet. Yeah, I think the threat's a bit exaggerated. I know it's a hot topic right now, and I know people are either entirely for it or entirely against it. I'm sure there's some middle of the road. I've got 3 Gen Z kids,
Right.
and yeah, they're 2 are Instagram users, 1 is more TikTok. Nobody's Facebook, like 0
Yeah.
on Facebook, very little Twitter. So that migration is taking place, and who knows what they're going to use next. But yeah, they're not quite as reliant. And quite frankly, Gen Z, from what I've seen among all my kids' friends, yeah, they use all those tools, but they're also better at socializing than you would imagine for a group of kids who have been raised on social media.
Completely. My oldest is Gen Y, and the social alacrity is just, it's Olympic gold medal.
Yeah, it's hard to walk away from other people, right?
Yeah.
It's, there are these tools that you can use to connect with people you might not otherwise encounter. But the face-to-face stuff, if you want a rich, rewarding life, is still more important than anything else.
Completely.
Which is part and parcel of what we do, right? It's why we hate Zoom speeches, right? The interaction's not there. The face-to-face isn't there. The Q&A goes flat. Everything about the experience changes dramatically. It's efficient, it's cost efficient, but it isn't necessarily the richest experience you can have.
And that's the word I use a lot too, the richness of a speech, the richness of the context. Look, in meetings today, and you've probably seen it yourself, keynotes are 45, 60. Now they've become 30, 45, maybe 30, and then 15 minutes of Q&A. Even the breakouts, even these, dare I say, forced, but even these other structured times, there's a lot more free time I've seen that event planners are structuring in, just based on post-pandemic, the new normal, and kind of what the current situation lends itself to.
I've always tried to lock in at 35 to 40 with 20 to 25 minutes of questions. Yeah. First of all, I don't want to hear me speak for an hour, and I'm me. And it's not that I burn out on the topics. It's just that holding an audience, engaging an audience for 60 straight minutes, I think is decades old as a concept. I just don't think, and even then people didn't sit still. And now they're sitting there with phones or devices, and it makes it that much harder for you to, maintain the flow, keep their attention. And I think the Q&A becomes much more dynamic. And again, the give and take is a better experience for everyone involved. And so I try to lean into that as much as possible. I like it better. And look, I always get questions that I don't love. Like when you guys are listening to your corporate overlords and you're saying what you're told to say, something, by the way, which has never happened to me in 39 years. And you try to explain the process that we go through. You try to explain what a news meeting is like. You try to explain what you do on a daily basis. Most people will accept it, and other people will literally shake their heads while you're speaking and say, no, that's not what happens. So that's a challenge in and of itself, right?
Right. And Q&A, which I've done some blogs on, and just for meeting planners, tips on what works and what doesn't work. There's always the question, which is a non-question. It's a monologue soliloquy.
Yes. And because it's fine. It's all good, right? It's the type of thing that just, you might walk away from it a little frustrated at one point if something like that comes up. But look, people want to share their point of view. And I think that's the beauty of the Q&A, is that becomes much more fertile ground for discussion.
Right. And, this sarcastic guy in me silently in my head is going, after a 90-second soliloquy, if I were the speaker, I would love to be, question is?
Yeah, well, and on occasion. But then again, look, I think what's really important from our perspective when you're in front of an audience is being mindful that despite the physical arrangement where you're standing above an audience most often, that's not the reality, right? The reality is you're on equal and level playing fields, and it should be treated as such. And so looking down upon the person who decides to voice an opinion is a mistake. And I think part of the problem that we have is people just don't listen. And I think listening is as important as speaking.
Yeah. For sure. It's a world where everybody's communicating and nobody's being heard. I think on that note, Ron, we're going to move into a little bit more lighthearted, whimsical part of our podcast. We're going to do some rapid fire.
Okay.
The key on both of our parts, I sometimes get stuck asking the question and then commenting on the answers. We're going to do a little bit of word association. I'm going to throw it out to you, and you give me the most concise and direct response.
Can I consult with my therapist first? That's all I want to.
Well, no, AI. Consult with AI first, okay? And then if that doesn't work, we'll go to the human.
Okay.
What's the most? You ready? Here we go.
I'm ready.
All right. What's the most interesting thing about you that we wouldn't learn from your resume?
I spent a lot of time studying religious history after having grown up Roman Catholic and having had a spiritual break when I was in my mid-30s. I committed myself to spending, as you can see from some of the books behind me, spending a lot of time, and this may sit well or not sit well with people, but unlearning everything I learned in Catholic school and CCD. And it was in some ways, a traumatic experience. I've come out of this as an agnostic and not a member of the church, but it was really a difficult endeavor. And it's something I committed to myself to for over a decade. And it's not really changed the way I view the world much. In fact, quite the opposite. I think I prefer ethics to morals. I prefer not knowing to knowing. And I also prefer having the freedom to allow my children in particular to find a spiritual course on their own that wasn't implanted in their brain.
Right.
And so that they have the freedom to make their own decisions, which is something early, obviously, in my life I didn't have.
What's your favorite way to relax?
A couple of things, working out and then playing my drums. And so I've been, hitting skins since in some form or another since I was 3 or 4 years old, formally since I was 9. I'm a very mediocre drummer, but I can play. And it's when I really want to relax or take out frustrations, there's nothing better than beating the hell out of a drum set and trying to break a cymbal while you're doing it.
What are 3 things that bring a smile to your face?
My wife, my kids for sure, and my wife for sure. Music and the movies.
What's a skill you don't have but wish you did?
Professional football quarterback.
Beautiful. Who would you love to interview but you can't?
Right now, well, honestly, yeah, Jesus. I would love. I mean, if I could do that one, and it's not to necessarily reinforce or unlearn anything. I'd like to know what he actually said and what he was really about relative to how his message was portrayed over the millennia. What's
the next country on your travel bucket list?
Well, my next actual visit is the Bahamas and the Caymans, which I've never been to. My next country would probably be Greece, as a desired location to stop at.
Social media, friend or foe?
Both.
I know you're quite active on Twitter.
Yeah, sometimes a little too active.
Yeah, it has its peaks and valleys.
Yeah.
How many times a week do you get asked for unsolicited financial advice?
Not as much as you'd think. And thankfully, I think a lot of people who do know me or who do recognize me from my years on TV will hopefully say they enjoyed my work, maybe say they made some money, which is not really kind of what I did on CNBC. I never really gave recommendations. But on occasion, I'll get requests for help. And again, since it's such an individual thing, I'm very careful about how I give advice, or more specifically, to whom I direct individuals for that advice, because it's not something I do for a living. And so I don't want to really, not knowing someone's full circumstances, just throw something out there, and hope that it works.
If you could go back in time to any point in history other than Jesus.
Okay, we'll take him off the menu here.
We'll take him off the list for now. Who not only would you interview, but where would you like to do it?
Probably, I'd like to go back to the Middle Ages, European Middle Ages, medieval times. Probably Henry VIII, I think.
Okay. That would be a rich Q&A.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there.
Right. So
probably, and not without some risk.
Right. That could be Disney Plus, Paramount, Hulu, Netflix, the whole night.
It's funny you asked me this, because we are some partners of mine and I have been working on a pilot called Old News, where I exist in the present day, but I go back, and it's actually a comedy bit. And so we've interviewed people out of history. So we started with Mary and Joseph. We went to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Napoleon and Josephine. And actually, it's with a couple that does a lot of improv work. And I find this stuff screamingly funny. I find them screamingly funny. And it's something we're hoping at some juncture to sell, because I get to be me, very straight, modern day.
Right.
and they get to riff all they want. I ask
Right.
legitimate historical questions.
Right. And there's nothing like being the straight guy in the middle of all that comedy storm.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it's hard, when you're mic'd up, like particularly if they really hit it, not to break.
Yeah.
But we hope that this thing has legs, because it's actually something I'd like to do. I'm a huge comedy fan, and I happen to be a huge fan of this couple. Their improv capabilities are really kind of epic, and it's fun to play with.
Yeah. And the improv, you talk about opportunity, everything for them. They're just constantly mindful and listening and present for every
Well,
opportunity.
when we do the breaking news about Jesus having, or a young man having been born who's already been identified as King of the Jews, and so I said to Joseph, listen, we've done this in such great haste. We didn't get your last name, and he's like, Rosenberg. So, how are you going to raise him? Well, we're going to raise him Jewish, but we're probably just going to do the holidays. They just really boom, boom, boom.
Right. Sounds like my house. Sounds like my
Yeah,
house.
exactly.
Well, Ron, on the holiday, just the holidays, I think we'll leave it on that note. I really enjoyed our time. I think it was a really rich conversation. There's a lot there for meeting professionals, event planners to learn from, and just anybody at large. We covered a lot of great areas where I always like to think people are going to be a little bit smarter for having joined us on our journey on this podcast. So thank you so much for doing this. And I know that I will be seeing you down the road for sure.
I certainly hope so. Thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it.
You got it. If you'd like to learn more about this speaker, visit our website at thekeynotecurators.com. There you'll find dozens of videos of speakers that are a perfect fit for your event. If you'd like to reach out directly, please click on the link below in the description. My name is Seth Dechtman, and you've been watching Curated Insights.